I had a verse that I thought we would read today. This verse was written in the 14th century, before the time of Chaitanya Mahaprabhu. So it's not a Gaudiya verse. But the verse was so famous and well thought of and appreciated that it became a favorite of Chaitanya Mahaprabhu and also of his followers. It predates the appearance of Mahaprabhu. This would be like, if there was a verse that was composed before Jesus walked the earth in the Talmud or something like that, or the Torah, but it was so appreciated by Jesus that it became woven into the fabric of Christianity. Okay. Or if you were to look at the Constitution of the U.S., and you were to notice that they had borrowed something from Plato's Republic or something like that. It's an earlier source. Varangi. Oh, I guess she's going to miss it. We'll go ahead and read the verse and then we can go from there. Ma yata panta poti bhima ratyaha. Ma yata. Ma is don't. Like Krishna says, ma shuchaha, don't fear or don't lament. In that famous verse in the Gita where he tells you to abandon all dharmas and just surrender to him. It's a very famous verse in the Gita. He finishes the verse and says, ma shuchaha, don't fear, don't lament. So the verse starts out the same way. It's prohibitive. Ma yata, don't go. Don't go where? Panta pati bhima ratya. Don't go on the path on the bank of the Bhima River. Don't walk along the path that goes along the bank of the Bhima River. Bhima River is a river in south central India. Mayata panta poti bhima ratya. Digambar kopi tamala nilaha. Because some person is there standing naked, dark like a tamal tree. Digambar means dressed in the directions. Dig means directions, and ambar means to be dressed. So digambar means dressed in the directions, which is another way, a fancy way of saying somebody's naked. In the Jain sect, the Jains are like an early pre-Buddhist sect of renunciates that existed in contrast to the Vedic culture. And so there were pre-Buddhist sects of renunciates. And the Jain sect is very, very famous. And so much of Buddhism and even Hinduism borrowed from the Jain religion. And the Jain saints are called Digambars because they walk around naked. So if you go to India, you'll find there's Svetambars, they dress in white, and there's Digambars, they go around naked. But within the Jain tradition, there's two broad groups, and one of the groups, their saints, walk around naked. There's other groups of Indian ascetics that walk around naked. Different types of Shaivas walk around naked. Lots of ascetics wear just a loincloth, but a number of them just go around like actually naked. And that seems racy, but if you live in India, they're just walking around doing things. Everybody gets what's going on, and nobody bats an eyelash. Just like you also see that Muslim men, when they get older and their hair goes all white, it's a very common thing that they, for whatever reason, like to put henna in their hair. There's some theory it's healthy. I don't know if that's actually true or not. But you get these Muslim guys with these ridiculously flaming orange goat beards and like red hair, and it's just like not red, like orange, like flaming orange meteorite hair. And it's just, first time you see it, you're like, that's ridiculous. But then you realize, oh, it's like all the old men, all the old Muslim men have this thing going on. It's like a thing they do. So, anyway. And so, Mayata Pantapati Bhima Ratyaha. Don't go on the path on the bank of the Bhima. Some person is there naked and they're dark like a tamal tree. Tamal Nila. Nila means dark. Tamal Nila means dark like a tamal tree. The tamal tree is a dark tree, which is oftentimes likened to Krishna. Just like the Kadamba flower is oftentimes likened to Radharani. Champak flower is likened to Radharani with its yellowish color. And then the tamal tree is likened to Krishna. Vinyasta hasta api nitamba bimbe. His hands are resting on his rounded hips. So, his hands are resting on his rounded hips. Vinyasta hasta means his hands are put down or placed down, resting. Nitamba means on your hips, and bimba means rounded. So nitamba bimba. Bimbe, resting on his hips. Mayata, don't go. Where don't you go? Panta pati bhima ratyaha, on the bank of the river Bhima, on that path. Why not? Because kopi, there's some person there that's digambar. He's naked, but he's tamal nila. He's darkish like a tamal tree. In other variations of this verse, it says pitambara, which means he's dressed in yellow. I think the verse was originally written like this, digambara. You guys will figure out why in a minute. But both variants are there. Pitambara, digambara, dressed in the directions, meaning standing naked, or pitambara, dressed in yellow, meaning wearing a yellow dhoti, like Krishna generally wears a yellow dhoti. Durta samakarshati chitta vittam. Although this is subtext. This isn't written. It's just implied. Although he's standing there with his hands resting on his hips, Durta samakarshati. He's cunningly stealing. He's cunning. He's stealing. What's he stealing? Chitta vittam, the wealth of your consciousness. Vitta means wealth. Chitta means consciousness. So he's samakarshati, krish, where you get the word Krishna from, attracting. This is samakarshati, taking away. It's from the same roots. He's taking it away. So instead of attracting it, he's taking it away. He's stealing it from you. Instead of pulling it towards you, he's taking it away from you. Dragging it away from you. And he's a cunning person. Mayata, don't go. Panta pati bhima ratya, on the path along the bank of the Bhima River. Because kopi, somebody's there and they are digambara or pitambara, they're dressed in the directions, they're naked, or they're dressed in yellow, and they're tamal nila, it's a contrast. They're wearing nothing, but they're dark. They're wearing yellow, but they're dark. Sometimes Krishna's described like a blue sapphire set in gold. the yellow dress is like a setting for the gem of Krishna. And that person is Vinyasta Hasta Api Nitamba Bimbe. Although he's standing with his hands resting on his hips in plain sight, nothing up his sleeve. He's naked, his hands are here, and he's just standing, he's not moving. Somehow or other, Durta Samakarshati, somehow he's expertly and cunningly stealing from you, although he's not doing anything. And what's he stealing? He's stealing Vitta, your wealth, the wealth of Chitta, your consciousness. This is a verse. Now, when you read a statement in English, there's two meanings of the statement. There's the denotative meaning and the connotative meaning. Denotative, it's what the words denote, what they literally mean if you looked them up in a dictionary. The denotation of the words. Then there's the connotation of the words. The connotation of the words is in context, what do they mean? Like if you say time flies, the literal meaning of time flies is there's something called time and it's flying through the air like a bird. So the literal meaning of time flies would be impossible. It'd be impossible. But the connotative meaning, in context, a colloquial meaning, a particular turn of phrase, that makes perfect sense. So you have the denotation of a word, you have the connotation of a word. And these are the two meanings you have access to in English. In Sanskrit, grammar theory, these things would be called abhida and lakshana. The indicative meaning is the connotative meaning, and the denotive or denotative, I got to look it up, but the denotative, I'm going to go with that. The denotative meaning would be abhida, what the word actually means. In Sanskrit poetry, you also have something called vyanjana, and that is the suggested meaning, which ultimately has to be based on what a word literally means or figuratively means. But the vyanjana meaning is something special that happens in Sanskrit poetry. Amongst poets, they believe in this. Grammarians in Sanskrit literature do not believe in this. But amongst poets, they believe in this. They believe that there's a certain meaning of a word, of a phrase, rather, that is suggestive. You can't get it through connotation. You can't get it through denotation. You have to meditate on the verse, and then like a holographic image, or like some sort of one of those, subversive images that sometimes hides within a painting, and you can see some other image within that painting. Then it reveals itself, and it stuns you, and you've exhausted the possibilities what your mind will allow you to gather. When you kind of turn your mind out of focus and meditate on the verse, something amazing happens. And that meaning of the verse is what poets strive for. They want to pierce your heart with the arrow of their words in such a way that it stuns you, paralyzes you. And even within ancient Sanskrit literature and grammarian debates, grammar debates amongst grammarians, you find some people refusing to accept that this poetic meaning actually exists. They say, no, it can always be broken down into one of those two. And that's actually true. Even the poets will admit it's either based in the literal meaning or the suggestive meaning. But it takes you beyond what you could ever understand on your own. This verse has a little bit of that going on. I kind of helped you guys out a little bit. He's standing on the bank of the river with his arms resting on his hips, and he's stealing the wealth of your consciousness. there's a paradox there. How can somebody steal something when their hands are resting on their hips and it's meant to stun you and be beautiful? And so you're getting this, that's already, you could say that's a little bit of a suggested meaning. There's a bigger one going on, which is what I want to talk about today. You guys following so far? Mayata panta pati bhima ratyaha. Don't walk on the bank of the river Bhima. Of course, that's not true. You are supposed to walk on the bank of the river. He's saying don't do it, but he's actually saying do it. He's employing some type of alliteration, a prohibitive alliteration, saying don't do it when he means actually do it. You get this, there's that famous scene in Gone with the Wind, which is the most popular romantic scene in cinematographic history. I think that's what it would be called. And that's when Scarlett O'Hara is telling Rex Harrison, don't, but she really means do, and he carries her through the threshold. Kind of like the original date rape. But she was, her eyes were suggesting otherwise. Her voice was saying one thing, but she meant something else. And in the right context, that wasn't considered to be, nowadays that would be considered, no means no. But there's some kind of like no sometimes means yes. And so that's what, and the movie, it was popular, and that scene was popular. They did some kind of a poll. And that was the most popular romantic scene in cinema, at least at the time the poll was taken. Now it's probably Titanic or something like that, but at least when the poll was originally done. And so that saying don't do this, but you're actually saying do it, that's been around. That's used by different cultures. I gave you an example you would be at least familiar with, hopefully, like in writing. I mean, I never even saw Gone with the Wind, so what to speak of you guys, but I know of the movie. Don't go on the path of the Bhima River. Digambara kopi ka api taman nila. There's a naked person there with beautiful dark color, a beautiful dark hue. Vinyasta hasta nitamba bimbe. Vinyasta hasta api nitamba bimbe. Although he's standing with his hands placed down upon his hips, nonetheless, durta, he's a cunning person, a deceitful person, and he's samakarshati, he's stealing away vittam, your wealth, the wealth of your mind. The literal meaning here doesn't work. That you're actually being told don't walk on that bank doesn't work. Right? That there's a magic act going on doesn't quite work. You're being forced to think a little more deeply. And so already getting into kind of a poetic understanding of the verse, you're being told that when you see Krishna, your material desires will fly away. Your mind will be enraptured by Krishna. Krishna is so attractive and beautiful and profoundly beautiful that he's going to steal away the wealth of your mind from whatever it might have been focused on. That's that's kind of like what's it called, a first pass. That's the beauty of the verse. That's a first pass. That's the beauty of the verse. But to really appreciate this verse, and this happens a lot with the Vyanjana vritti, with a suggested meaning, with the poetic meaning, you need to know the culture. So, in central India, If India was like the U.S., it'd be kind of more or less like where Colorado is. In central India. A little bit to the west. A little bit to the south, maybe. So maybe whatever's below Colorado, Nebraska or something like that, Oklahoma, I don't know. Anyway, there's a state called Maharashtra. The state's fairly large. The city Mumbai is in Maharashtra on the western seaboard. Inland, 10 hours inland, something like that. There is, by driving, there is a holy town called Pandharpur. And the major deity of that town is called Vittal. Vittal is the deity in Pandharpur. And Vittal is the deity of Krishna. He's worshipped with Rukmini. So it's Vittal Rukmini. And there's a group of Vaishnavas there who worship him. They're called the Varkaris. They're vegetarian. They chant Ram, Krishna, Hari. They do kirtan with mridanga and kartals. And they walk on pilgrimage twice a year, once in June, July, and once in Kartik, October, November. Twice a year they walk from wherever they live to the temple, camp out on the road, cook on the road, and they make a walking pilgrimage. And hundreds of thousands of pilgrims show up, and it's the most popular temple in the whole state of Maharashtra. And it's a Vaishnav temple, deity of Krishna. Sometimes you'll see them smoking like beedies, like kind of hand-rolled cigarettes, whatever. So they're not like necessarily the most well-behaved people from our standard, but many of them are quite strict, and this is their tradition that they were born with. They're part of a social equality movement, social, I don't know what's the word I want to use, upliftment movement, where this temple was the first temple to allow untouchables and women to serve as priests. The first major temple in India with a long history. And that was just in the last decade. And around the time of Gandhi, they started letting untouchables into the temple. The temples are largely kind of casteist in India, and sometimes low castes won't be allowed in, but this temple allows everybody in. And everybody who comes in the temple is allowed to touch the deity. So you go in the temple and you walk in. I've been to the temple before. You walk in and there's a kirtan mandap, which is like this, and you can see the deity. But then you can also get in a queue, and you walk around a really long queue, and you go past all these tombs of the saints, and then you get in front of the deity, and then you get to touch the feet of the deity. And everybody does. And like the priests are there surrounding the deity, and they kind of grab you and manhandle you, put you in front of the deity, shove your head down, and then shove you along, because there's tons of pilgrims coming. But everybody who comes and stands in that queue, sometimes for like 8, 10, 12 hours, you get to actually touch the deity. There's a Garuda Stamba there. There's also a little altar for Ganesh there. Some of the tombs of our saints are there, of their saints. Namdev is there. One other saint is there as well. Just like we have Prabhupada's Samadhi in Vrindavan, right next to the temple, or so many of our Gaudiya temples have the tombs of our saints there. So they have the tombs of their saints, the Vaishnav temple. And they sing, and they do kirtan, and they go on pilgrimage. And they're Vaishnavas. And they have a few saints. They have Namdev and Eknath, but their main saint is Tukaram, my namesake, the person I was named after. And so he was a 17th century powerful Vaishnava who wrote poetry, and he was devoted to this deity, Vittal. He was from a town called Dehu, not too far away, and he was devoted to this deity of Vittal. So to understand this verse, you have to understand this temple. The temple of Vittal is located on the bank of the Chandrabhaga River. The Chandrabhaga River is a tributary of the river Bhima. There's a river in India called Bhima. And so it's a sacred river that runs through India. And in that part of the state, in that area, the river is called the Chandrabhaga. And the temple is on the bank of the river. Our ISKCON property is also on the bank of the river. The river's there, the temple's there, and then on the other side of the river is our ashram. And we have a boat in our ashram. We go across the river on the boat, and then we take darshan. And the deity of Vittal, which is on the bank of the river Bhima, is unusual in India. It's unusual in India because the deity comes from a story of someone named Pundalik. Pundalik was a great devotee. He was a materialistic person, mistreated his parents, and was low class, and he had an ecstatic vision while on Tirtha Yatra, and he realized that he had been sinful by being disrespectful and abusive towards his parents, and so he became very devoted to his parents. He was also a Vaishnava, and he was serving his parents, and Krishna was so pleased at his devotion to his parents and his simplicity and his change of heart that Krishna blessed him and came to see him. And so Krishna knocked on the door of his home incognito to come and visit him. And Pundalik said, wait outside. I'm serving my parents. When I'm done, I'll attend to you. Not knowing it was God himself, the object of devotion for his whole family for many generations. And he took a brick and he threw the brick outside. He said, it's raining, so stand on the brick. That way your feet will stay dry. They won't get muddy. And so Krishna stood on the brick and waited for his devotee. And that deity of Vittal stands on a brick. And that's where it came from. And then he realized who it was. He made prayer, said, please stay. And Krishna took on the form of a deity and stayed in that place for 1,000 years. And it's the major place. It's the most visited temple in the whole state of Maharashtra. And Krishna stands on a brick. And so Krishna's standing on the brick. Now, if you're standing and waiting around, if you're hanging out, doing like standing around, waiting around, what do? What do you do with your hands? You put your hands on your hips and you wait. So the deity of Vittal stands on a brick and standing like this. It's a beautiful black stone deity of Krishna, kind of semi-relief, like on a big piece of stone, carved out of a big piece of stone. And it's standing like this. And that deity and that holy place was where one of the most famous poets in all of India lived. It was a deity of Krishna, and he spent his life at that temple worshiping that deity. And now you can listen to the poetry. Don't go on the path on the bank of the Bhima River, because someone's standing there naked like a deity. Sometimes deities have undergarments carved into them. But one of the wonderful things about the deity also is that you get to see the Abhishek every day. So, 5 o'clock in the morning, they ritually bathe the deity and undress the deity, and you can sit there and watch the whole thing go on for 2-3 hours, which I had the good fortune to do when I was a young man. And so you go there early in the morning and you sit and they do kirtan, and the Abhishek goes on in view of the audience, in view of the pilgrims. So I visited there in 1996. I went there and saw it. Maybe it was 95, but 25 years ago, something like that. Don't go on the bank of the Bhima River. The Lord is standing there, just standing there with his hands on his hips, but stand there with his hands, he's stealing your mind. So the verse works as an ecstatic revelation of Krishna. But this devotee is talking about his seeing the deity in the temple. That's the suggested meaning, is that he's simultaneously telling you about seeing God directly, and he's telling you about seeing the deity in the temple. You follow? That's the poetry. Because for him, seeing the deity in the temple was non-different than seeing Krishna directly. For Pundalik, the original devotee to whom Krishna appeared, there was also no difference between seeing the deity, because the deity was Krishna in a miraculous manifestation. So, what I want to talk about today was not Sanskrit grammatic theory, or even really this piece of poetry per se. I want to talk about the deity in the temple. How we view the deity, what we think of the deity, why we venerate the deity, the value of the deity in our temple. I can't see anything off the top of my head that would prohibit an omnipotent deity from appearing in this world in a form you could touch. Could Krishna walk in this room right now? No, of course not, because Krishna's made out of spirit and we're made out of matter and we've only got material eyes. But could an omnipotent deity walk in the temple right now and through his grace give you divine eyes so that you might be able to see him? Sure, that's what it means to be omnipotent. Now, would Krishna do that? Well, I would argue, I am arguing right now, that an all-good God would do that. An all-powerful God could do that, and an all-good God would do that. Out of sympathy and empathy and mercy and grace, Krishna would make himself available in a tangible form we could sink our teeth into and touch in this world as a vehicle or a bridge through which we could then eventually cross over into an actual experience of divinity. An all-good God would make it easy for us like that. Could that deity do so without that icon becoming an idol? If he was all-powerful, it would certainly seem that he could. Moses Maimonides, the 11th century Jewish rabbinic scholar, very, very famous, he said that God can't be a person because God's everywhere in all things and a person can't be in two places at once. Well, you can't be in two places at once, but you're not the only possibility of a person. That would be anthropomorphic to assume that if God was a person, he'd have to be a person exactly like you. How come God couldn't be a spiritual person? How come being a person means necessarily having a material body? Why couldn't a spiritual person have a spiritual form that didn't limit them? We would critique Maimonides for this. If you look at rabbinic writings on why God cannot be in an icon or an idol, if you follow the Christians. Christians don't have their own theories about idol worship. They borrow all their theories from the Jews, which is why the Old Testament is where you have to go to get all these admonitions against graven images and engraved images. You follow? And then the admonitions against idolatry all come from the Torah. So if you want to understand how 3 billion people think, you got to go and look at how 13 million people think, because that's where those 3 billion people got their ideas, their theological ideas about deity worship. It's an interesting thing because people have icons. Christians will wear a cross oftentimes. If you say, "What is that?" "Oh, it's an icon." So, or they'll have a church, which they think is a special place, or they'll have a place up there where they think it's special. They'll have certain hymns they think are important. They'll have a book that they venerate. But somehow they escape those things being seen as idols. How they do that? I think they just stupefy themselves. And they're hypocritical. And they subject themselves to one standard, and they subject everybody else to another standard. And the icons of my tradition become the idols of your tradition. It's not like they say, when you look at that image, when you venerate that deity, are you thinking that that's God and there's many gods and that God's not all powerful? Or do you understand that God's the father and mother of the universe? It's not like they're asking what your theology is and then judging your practice based on that. They just say, oh, that's your thing? That's idol worship. Oh, that's our thing? That's iconography. I think it comes from some sort of hypocritical double standard. Because I don't preach the prevailing religion of the land I'm in, I have to get a bit more sophisticated in my approach. I have to discuss and argue for everything and make things make sense and anticipate doubts and make things reasonable and take exotic things and put them into packages people can understand. If I want to critique somebody, I got to actually subject myself to the same standard because people will be quick to point out my hypocrisy, and I got to make sure that the knife cuts both ways and I'm being fair in my critique. When you're the prevailing religion of the land, you don't have to do that. You can just hate on everybody else, and because you're the main gig in town, you're the default position. When most people in the U.S. are having maybe not now, because for the first time in history, white people don't make up half of the population in the U.S., more than half. But for most of recorded history, this very, very brief history of the U.S., I guess like a very, very small, I guess for like a couple of 100 years is really what I'm trying to say. But even then, we killed a bunch of Native Americans. So maybe we have like 150 years where white people were the main group. And that didn't include me. My grandparents came over. I'm not even in that group. But it used to be that if you had a moment, if you were in the U.S. and you had an epiphany and you turned towards God, you go to your local church because you were raised Christian, you were taught about Jesus, and so when you got around to getting spiritual, that's where you go. So they have like an automatic funnel going to them. It's like a drain, like everything just kind of automatically goes down there. To get somebody into another church, you have to actually scoop them out and like move them somewhere else. It's like a transplant. Anyway, the good side of that is you got to learn to justify your beliefs and compare and contrast them to others and be fair and not be hypocritical and have a well-reasoned faith and so on and so forth. That's a good thing that comes out of it. So an all-powerful God could certainly walk into this temple right now and bless all of us. And all good God would want to. The same admonition, the same philosophy, that leads to the Jewish prohibition against deity worship, that you don't want to have a materialistic conception of God, that exact same idea of not having a materialistic conception of God results in Hindus making deities. Because they think, don't have a materialistic conception of God, realize that God is everywhere and in all things, and therefore God, by His grace, can also be present in the temple. So the same philosophical idea, the same theology, that God is all good and all powerful, is available to all people, that leads one group to decide, okay, no deities. Because it's going to make you think it's that thing as opposed to this thing. It's just in the temple. It's just that deity as opposed to everywhere. But the other group goes, oh, God's everywhere. We got to make a deity to represent our understanding that God's everywhere in all things. We got to have deities made out of wood, deities made out of stone. We got to have paintings that serve as deities. We got to have like even rocks, sacred rocks from particular places that are sacred, or a piece of a mountain. All those things are talismans because God's everywhere in all things, and we have to celebrate that. Well, that's pantheism. Not necessarily. Not if we also understand that God is both transcendent as well as immanent. Not if we have that. In code in our theology, we could easily play that game, that God's everywhere, and therefore we have to have deities, and still nurture that idea that God is transcendent. And in fact, that deity becomes part of what an all-good God would do to become available and allow you to enter into an intimate, loving relationship, because how else would you do it? How else would you enter into an intimate, loving relationship with the deity if you weren't given some training wheels? And that's what deity worship is. You dress the deity. You bathe the deity. You clean the deity. You serve the deity. You cook for the deity. You visit the deity. You go on pilgrimage to the deity. You give things up for the deities. You take vows in front of the deities. You keep your vows so you can go on the altar and worship the deity. And your whole life becomes about Krishna. How would you do that if you were just thinking of a deity? And of course, if you were just thinking of something in your head, guess what? If you're materialistic, those thoughts are also materialistic. So a mental image of God or a song or anything is also an idol if those people who made it were materialistic. You can't get around it. It's not like your thoughts are automatically spiritual. If you think they are, just hang out for a minute and examine them and you'll realize they're not all spiritual. So why are your thoughts inherently more deifiable in the form of songs and words and poems and praise and meditations than the deity in the temple? We should look at the character of the people sharing this revelation about God. We should look at their character. We should examine them the same way you examine a doctor or a lawyer before retaining their services, availing yourself of their services. But the mere fact that this is how we do it, I can't see a reason why that's inherently wrong, why it's inherently at odds with the idea of God being all good and all powerful and transcendental. So we have deities in our temple. We understand that God is the creator of the universe. But we understand that Krishna is so kind that he makes himself available and he comes into the consciousness of those pure souls who love him, and to make their vision accessible to people who are not as saintly as they are, they create icons that can act as a bridge that you can see and taste and touch and smell with your material body en route to engaging with the deity in your spiritual body. We don't stop the meditation goes on. We don't stop the chanting of the Lord's name, that also goes on. In fact, that's the core part of the deity worship in any Vaishnava tradition. The ritual does not overpower the devotion. But without a ritual culture, how will you actually get serious about spiritual life? Without a reason to wake up in the morning and go to sleep at night and follow the rules and regulations and take vows, and without a reason to cook and a reason to clean and a reason to dress, how will you stop yourself from being a deity in your own life? So I want to talk about deity worship, which I just did. And I thought of this verse because this verse is the apex of deity worship. It's an ecstatic savant who's having an actual relationship with God. Bilva Mangalthakur's story is out of this world. He was a Brahmin. He was trained in Vyakaran and grammar. He was trained in Kavya and poetry. He was trained in Alankar, alliteration, all the stuff we just talked about. But he fell down. He got into it with a low-class woman whose name was Chintamani. Her name was Chintamani, like a lady of the night. Generally, it would be translated as a prostitute, but it was a woman he was having an affair with, essentially. And she would have, had affairs with a number of men, and was unmarried and beautiful, and made her living by, kind of doing like a girlfriend experience type thing. And he was so lusty that he left in the dead of night his home, and he swam across a river, grabbing a hold of a corpse, climbed a wall, grabbing a hold of a snake, and finally got to see this prostitute. And she said, if you had just like a fraction of the devotion for Krishna that you have for me, you'd be self-realized. And he remembered, like, what am I doing with my life? And so he gave it all up and became saintly. And even then, when he was saintly, he became bewildered at some point, and he was trying to seduce a pious man's wife. And it kicked in again, this disgust, and he took some sewing needles and he poked out his eyes. Which obviously we're not recommending. This is something that people are supposed to do. He poked out his eyes, he was blind. And then he went to Vrindavan and he worshipped Krishna. And Krishna used to come and visit him and have interactions with him. And he wrote this beautiful divine poetry. You know, after this like life of mistakes and 2 steps forward and 3 steps back, and he had a long and rocky road. But eventually he was able to see Krishna with the eyes of his soul. And Krishna was there for him, and he had many wonderful experiences with Krishna, and he wrote about them. And that text is the Krishna Karanamrita, which has been sacred to our Gaudiya tradition since its inception. Mahaprabhu himself read the Krishna Karanamrita and was so ecstatic he had it copied. And that text is famous all over India, but it's especially dear for the Gaudiyas. We write commentaries on it, even though it's not our text. It's written in beautiful Sanskrit poetry. And that Bilva Mangal Thakur, also known as Leela Sukha, he composed this text, and this is one of the verses from the text. And it's about that deity in Pandharpur. That's the main deity of my namesake, and the deity standing with his 2 arms. And so, don't go on the bank of the Bhima River means do go visit Pandharpur. Because there's somebody there, they're naked, just like a deity is undressed. And they're dark, just like the deity is carved out of black stone. And they're standing there peacefully with their hands on their hips. What are they going to do? But somehow you go there and it steals your mind and you forget everything else. You forget your lust, anger, and greed, and you begin on the path of auspiciousness. Because you take that image that was carved according to the directions of our saints, whose minds were less fettered than ours, who had a clearer vision of Krishna's beauty than we did. And you take that stone and you take that deity and you worship it with devotion, and something magical happens. Krishna protects you. He nourishes you. He helps you. He doesn't forsake you. Everybody who serves the deity has the same experience. You got to spend some time. It doesn't happen in 5 seconds. But if you take it seriously and you serve the deity with faith and devotion, miracles happen in your life. You gain incredible faith in God. You never lose it. It's yours forever. We good? It's yours forever. You gain concrete realization in Krishna's mercy. You experience Krishna's mercy. You have a focal point for your devotion. You have a springboard for your meditation. And Krishna gradually enters into your consciousness and replaces your material conception of divinity with a spiritual one. You kind of don't even know what's happening. And pretty soon you're looking at the deity and you're having these ecstatic revelatory experiences that you only read about in books. So don't do that. Our poets liked this poetry so much that they went and composed their own poetry based on this. If you look at the works of Rupa Goswami, our primary framer 500 years ago, he wrote prayers. Don't go to the bank of the Yamuna. And look at Krishna playing his flute with his body bent in 3 places. With this, he's playing his flute bent in 3 places. Don't look at that if you're attached to society, friendship, and love, because all those things will be lost. He wrote poetry based on this poetry and just Vrindavanized it and made it suitable for our tradition. but the same theme, the same idea. That's how important this stuff was. Before there was a printing press, before there was an internet, what to speak of an internet, these poems were so sacred, they would copy them down. Mahaprabhu had a dozen copyists writing down the Krishna Karanamrita. And these poems, when they were beautiful, the saints would read them about, oh, that's beautiful, and they'd memorize it. Mayata Panta Pati Bhima Ratyaha Digambara Kopi Tamal Nilaha Vinyasta Hasta Api Nitamba Bimbe Durta Samakarshati Chitta Vitam. They memorized the verses, just like I did. I read it enough times during class, I've memorized it now. And so they memorized the verses, carry them around with them. And they became special and sacred. And this is our tradition and how it grew. And so even within this old poetry, even within this kind of old ecstatic poetry, there's this idea of deity worship. It's encoded in it. It's automatic. It's assumed you get it. That the deity is Krishna. And then when he's talking about his ecstatic revelation with Krishna, with a thief, he's talking about Krishna who's going to steal away all your worries. And when he's talking about that revelation of Krishna, it's the deity, and they're one and the same, and you just have to realize that, because Krishna's right there for you. Just like he's always been right there for you. You just couldn't get it. So you see Krishna right there in front of you to realize that Krishna's always right there, even in your heart. But then when you realize that, you realize, oh my God, that is really Krishna, because Krishna really was there. And through that Krishna, I found this Krishna. Okay. Thoughts, discussion? You want to chime in, write something, speak something?
Nice to see you together, brother.
Likewise, Adi Prabhu, very nice to see you. Hare Krishna, thank you. Very nice to see you, Prabhuji.
I'm proud of you. With only 3 people, your determination to continue preaching.
By your blessings, Prabhu. By your grace and your good wishes and your blessings. We can't wait to see you. As soon as the governor gives permission, we'll open up. We'll start just opening up for darshan, so we can still distance, and eventually we'll build up to having programs. We're going to wait for the governor to deem it suitable, but we're excited. We're excited to see all the Vaishnavas again and sit together in a strong kirtan with your good self. Anything else? Yes, loud.
I really appreciated your take on deity worship. I feel like this isn't my first time hearing it, but it's like a nice little summary, and yeah, it helped me contextualize Krishna better, so that I'm not just imagining this deity in my head all the time.
Thank you. Thank you, Ella. Did you hear that, Ajapu? Could you hear that? You heard what she said? Okay. Good. Anything else? And there it is. We're going to do kirtan now. And so you can stay, and we'll give you a nice darshan of the deities, and we'll do kirtan. You can hear the kirtan, see the deity.